I'm Matt Elman, and you're listening to the Complete Confidence with Cambridge podcast. We've got lots of useful tips and tricks to help you plan your school year as you prepare your learners for their Cambridge English qualifications. Whether you've been teaching exam classes for years or just at the start of your teaching career, come along with us. We'll help you unpack the English language exam journey using our own real-life experience and easy-to-follow examples from the exam preparation course Complete. So, let's get started. Today's episode is brought to you by Greg Archer. Greg has been in English language teaching since 2010. He worked for 7 years in an international college, teaching Cambridge exam classes and managing the English language department. He's now a freelance author, teacher and teacher trainer, and is one of the authors of Complete Advanced.
Hello, and thank you for joining me for this third and final podcast of the series, where today I'm going to be talking about getting the students ready for the exam. We're going to be looking at this in 3 parts. First of all, seeing the C1 handbook, the teacher's handbook for this level, and seeing what we can do to use that to support the learners. We're going to be having a think about using productive tasks and what we can be doing at this stage of the course. And we're going to be thinking about how to refine their exam technique. So here we are. We're moving slowly but swiftly towards the end of the course, and the students are very possibly starting to get a little bit more nervous about doing the exam, which is completely natural. So it's our job in the classroom as the teacher to kind of put their mind at ease, to help support them, to understand kind of where they are at their stage of development and how prepared they are, and to help them in their language development. And that's the main thing. We are still teaching language. We're still getting them to improve their language. I'm going to start by looking at the C1 Advanced Handbook, which is available at cambridgeenglish.org. I mentioned this in the previous podcast, and if you haven't already used it with your class, now is an ideal time to do so. This is the big idea of getting towards the end of the course at this point. We really don't want to keep showing students new things. We want to kind of get them to review and recycle as much as possible, at the same time thinking about what they need to do on exam day. And the handbook is really, really helpful for this. And one reason why it is extremely helpful is that it gives you and your learners a number of examples of authentic answers from previous writing tasks and how they would be marked by an examiner, together with comments. And the first thing I would say to this is you can use this to really get your students aware of what the examiner will be looking for when they get into the exam room, and once they've written their paper and they've handed it over, what happens then? How does the examiner view it? And this is the time to start introducing them to what the criteria actually mean. For example, this idea of communicative achievement. What does that really mean? Well, it's about using the conventions of the task and producing some writing which is appropriate for the task. We looked at this in podcast 2. What is appropriate? What language is appropriate? And another thing that it says on page 37 of the teacher's handbook, one of the aspects of communicative achievement is holding the target reader's attention. Again, we looked at this idea of a target reader in the previous podcast, in podcast 2, where we think about the idea of who we're actually writing for, and a mix of straightforward and complex ideas. This is the time to introduce the students to these, to what the examiner will really be looking for in this amount of detail. I think any time before this, it's not necessarily going to help them, but it will help them at this stage to think, okay, how are we going to get there? How are we going to put across our best candidacy to the examiner on the day? It's also a good way of showing them that in the writing part of the exam, their language is only one part of the overall mark. Even at this late stage of the course, you often find that students kind of think, well, if I get in that exam room and I show off I try and write the best grammar I possibly can and complex sentences as often as possible, and I really try and use a wide range of vocabulary, then I'm going to get a great mark. You might get a great mark, but it will only be for language. That's only 25% of the overall mark. So it's really about cementing it in their minds. Yes, of course, you've got to use your English language skills, but you can't necessarily just think it's all about that. So as I say, in the handbook, there are a number of sample answers for questions that are assessed and given examiner comments. These are fantastic to look at. And the main reason I think they're fantastic to look at is because they really reassure students about their own abilities. For example, if we look at the sample answer on page 41, the candidate who has written this essay has received 5 out of 5 for content and 4 out of 5 for all the other 3 criteria. I really advise using this in class. This surprises my students because the language that is used and the complexity, it isn't a really, really high level. It's a good C1 level, but I think students kind of get a little bit into the mindset that everything has to be absolutely perfect to get a high score in the exam. And it reassures them that this candidate who got 5 out of 5 for content and 4 out of 5 for everything else has not produced a completely perfect essay. I give it to my students and they kind of immediately jump on the fact that there are several examples of language that isn't entirely correct. The candidate writes, for example, regarding of the green spaces, you can do at these days, there is almost countless list. And they feel kind of inspired by the fact in a way that, yeah, you can make mistakes. You don't have to attempt to get absolutely everything perfect to get a really good score. But this is a good example, the sample answer on page 41, of an appropriately written paper with the right target reader in mind. There's those terms again from the previous podcast. You also, in the teacher's handbook, have example answers that were slightly less successful. The report on page 42, for example, it doesn't get the scores that the candidate did on page 41. But this is a good way of engaging the students with what they're going to be doing on the exam day. They discuss, well, how could they improve it? How could this candidate have improved it? What was it missing? So you get the students to analyse what this answer, how successful this answer has been. Why did they only get 2 for communicative achievement? They didn't get 5 out of 5 for content, but they still got 4. And incidentally, this is a really useful way to show them because all the example answers in the handbook get either 4 or 5 for content. And content is 25% of the overall mark. So this reassures them, basically, if you do what the question is asking you to do and you fulfill all that, then you are going to get a good score for 25% of your overall mark. You've got your content in the bag. So they start talking about what it means and why the communicative achievement wasn't quite as good. There are examiner comments on this. You don't have to show them, the students, this initially. Just get them to think about why. And the examiner has written that the layout of the report uses the conventions of the task effectively, but the register slips occasionally. I got very impressed. This still excites me. And so they're thinking about, is this entirely appropriate, what this candidate has produced? And it's not an extremely appropriately written paper. You could also get them for homework to write their own upgraded version of this text that was less successful. Get them to write the report again, but make it more successful. Think about where it wasn't entirely appropriate and write their own upgraded version. And there are also plenty of speaking tests available. You should also do this with the speaking part of the exam. Start your learners thinking about what the criteria actually means. What is the difference between where it says in the handbook, interacts with ease, linking contributions to those of other speakers? And what's the difference between that and initiates and responds appropriately, linking contributions? Now, this is language that advanced level students are going to understand, but so it will help them to kind of figure out exactly. And also point them to the idea that, again, in the speaking test, if you go in to that exam room thinking, I'm going to try and show you as many interesting vocabulary items as I can, I'm going to try and do the best grammar I possibly can when I speak, that's the wrong thing to focus on. Because in the speaking test, they also get assessed on discourse management, pronunciation, and interactive communication. Well, what does that mean, interactive communication? Well, essentially, the examiner in the room is assessing them on how well they communicate with the other person. Are they bringing the other person into the conversation? Are they responding to them effectively enough? Are they managing this as a discussion? Because, honestly, take it from me, I've had students in the class before that however much you tell them, when they get in the exam room, they treat the exam like a monologue. They go in and they start speaking and they barely look at the other person. And they'll get marked down for that. So the handbook is a really useful way of raising their awareness of what they're going to need to do in that exam room. And you can also show them speaking tests that you can access via cambridgeenglish.org of candidates in the past. And there are examiner comments on these as well. Why has this candidate done better than this candidate? These are always great to use in class. And again, they give the students a bit of confidence because the people in these videos, they are not the most proficient speakers in the world, but they're very, very good. And that is really what your students should be aiming for. Not complete proficiency, but something at a good C1 level. Let's move on to productive tasks in the classroom and what to do at this stage of the course. Now, as you may be starting this part of the course, and you've still got stuff to do, still got units in the book to cover. But even when you've covered them, there's very often this idea of, from the teachers and the students, okay, we've finished the book. Well, have you finished the book? I mean, have you covered every single thing that you possibly could? Have you mined every text? Well, this is the point at the end of the course to think, absolutely fine to go back to stuff we've already done, because after all, there's so much of language learning that occurs with repetition and recycling and reviewing language. There's nothing wrong with going back. So maybe there's something in the text that you missed out. It could be something in the course book that you've already done. Now, I've always found it really useful to get students to go back and do a productive task again that they have done at some point before. Particularly something that they can really see progress that they've made. So, for example, I might get them at the end of the course, at this stage in the course, to go all the way back to Unit 2 and rewrite the same report. Try it again. Do it again and see how you get. So as we get towards the end of the course here, and maybe we have finished the book, something that I've always been inclined to do, and would be in this case, is to go back to Unit 2 and say to the students, rewrite this report that we did all the way back then at the start of the course. Rewrite it. I'm not going to give you any help, but treat it as you've been given this particular report to write in the exam, and see how you get on. And you'll be surprised to see that at this point in the course, very often without any support from you, they can produce something that is better than the one they initially produced in Unit 2 way back at the beginning of the course. And it is unbelievably motivating for students who can see the progress that they've made. So what I've often done is to kind of keep photocopies of the students' work. They should be keeping copies of their work. And if they can compare Unit 2's report to the report they write at the end of Unit 12, they will hopefully be able to see that progress, and that gives them confidence. And this is the big thing. We're working towards their big exam, and giving them confidence is an absolutely vital piece of the puzzle. And there's another idea that's tied up with going back and doing what you've done before. As you approach exam day, I would really try and avoid introducing too much new language. Why would that be? Well, my theory is that I can remember from my days of taking exams at secondary school, and obviously I wasn't studying English language, but if I was studying a subject where the teacher was kind of getting, we've got an exam soon, and they try and push too much cramming in at the end and new content, it doesn't really go well for the students. They kind of get too nervous about what they're going to do in the exam. So really the mindset to get in at this point is, we haven't finished the book. We can always go back and do some more, but let's think about how we recycle that language. Of course, if there are new things that come up in your classroom, then focus on them, but don't decide to bring in lots and lots of new vocabulary items or new, anything new to that extent. Now, it's important to keep going with the productive tasks in class. A lot of students will get into exam mode at this point and think, why am I not doing lots and lots of practice tests for the exam? Well, this is something I mentioned in a previous podcast. What is the benefit of overdoing more and more practice again and again of an exam paper? At this point, it's certainly beneficial, but not in every class. And as I said before in a previous podcast, it's so important to get the students using the language and practicing it. So something that I often do, I mentioned a moment ago that you can access speaking tests online. Well, yes, this is a good way of seeing what the examiner's looking for and how the speaking test is assessed, but they're also good for practice. For example, you could play the speaking video in class, and at certain points you could pause it and get students to answer the questions that the interlocutor, that the examiner has said on the screen. So you run it up to the first question for the examiner, pause it, and then your students get to have a go. And then after they've done that, they can give each other tips, but then you can play back what is on the speaking video and they can compare their turns to what was actually done originally. This is getting them always thinking about how to improve, how to reflect on what they've done, and it gets them to really understand this idea of the whole concept of a speaking test. It isn't just about the language that you are producing. It's tied up with a lot of different aspects. Remember a moment ago I mentioned that discourse management and interactive communication are assessed in the exam. Well, quite a fun activity that I do in class regularly helps them to develop these skills that will enable them to get a higher score in both of these things, hopefully, which is if you put them into pairs, I will take all the student A outside of the class and I will give them a role and then send them back in to do a bit of speaking practice. And that role could be, when you go back in, interrupt your partner. It could be, when you go back in and you speak to your partner, talk about things that aren't relevant to the question that you're talking about. When you go back there and speak to your partner, give too many personal stories. Talk about yourself a bit too much. Because this interactive communication and discourse management in parts 3 and 4 of the exam, that's where they really should be working together. And if you give them practice that somebody is trying to stop them effectively working, or is interrupting them too much, or is going off on a tangent too much, it gives them practice in kind of managing discussions. And also, and this is a key thing, it's a lot of fun. You know, my students will come into the class and they will get into this idea of, oh, I've got to interrupt you, or I've got to say very little. And that bit of fun at this stage of the course is really, really important, keeping things going and keeping spirits high. Don't forget as well at this point in the course to get students to practice the speaking exam in groups of 3. Because it could come to the point in the exam where they are the last 3 people and they get put together as a 3. If they've not had a go at that already, then make sure they do it. They get more time because they are a 3, but it's really, really important to do that. Another example of a productive activity, this one could be for writing, where students work together. You give student A report to write and you give student B a proposal to write. And basically, they swap over. Student A will write the introduction of the report. Student B will write the introduction of the proposal. When they've done that, they swap papers. What is this actually doing? Well, this is kind of getting them to think on their feet because, you know, if you give them a time limit and they've not only got to produce something effective, but they've got to kind of get into the idea that someone else has originally started. It's good for kind of that mental acuity, that mental development of, well, I've got to write this. How do I do this? And this brings me on to the final part of today's podcast, which is about refining exam technique. And it's not really one of the easiest things to do in class, I find. Of course, you could give them past papers every class, but is it really refining their exam technique? Because where does that come from, the desire to refine that exam technique? Well, it comes from apprehension about the exam. How do you make sure that they are going to maximise their time in the exam room? Well, one example, the reading and use of English paper. By this point, they will know what happens in each part. And they know that they've got to do all those parts in the exam room. So what could we possibly do to help them refine exam technique? Well, number one, they've got a time limit. And like every exam you've ever sat or I've ever sat, one of the key things is make sure you get as many marks as possible. And that might mean doing the exam paper not in the order it's written. So a student could think, well, I'm not entirely confident on a part 6, so I might leave that to the end. Their time management is important at this point, but if they really, really think, I'm weak on this part, then I think it's a good advice to say to them, okay, make sure you get every single mark you can before that. But they are going to feel a lot more pressure on exam day. And that feeling of pressure is difficult to simulate in the classroom itself, because they've got a classroom activity going on, they've got their peers, they've got their friends. So here's a tip for you, and this is one thing that I think always helps. And you know what it's like on exam day when you're sitting there and you look up and the clock suddenly seems to have moved forward 20 minutes and you thought it had only been 5 minutes and you think, oh my goodness, is that something you can identify with? It certainly is for me. We've all taken exams at some point in our life. Well, why not do that in class? Reduce the time that you allocate for exam tasks by 10%. I've even done something quite sneaky in the past where the students have got their heads down and they're writing their exam papers. I've removed the clock from the wall and just set it forward by about 7 minutes. Now, what it did was kind of mimic this concept of exam room pressure. Another thing you can do when you're going through listening tasks with them, you can very easily on audio apps these days speed up what you're playing back. And it's very useful for them to go through very least one part, but maybe even full parts of the listening test when you have increased the speed of the audio by, say, 10 or 15%. And because obviously in the listening test they hear the audio twice. So what I often do is I will play it the first time, I will play it increased by 15%, and they see how many questions they get right. And then when we play it back on the second time, we slow it down to normal speed. And the difference is amazing because it feels like they're talking really slow, but you can say to students, no, it's not slow. This is how they're going to speak when it comes to exam day. So again, it's thinking about how to be creative in this way of taking away some of that pressure. Mimic the pressure, if you can, from exam day, but then show them it's not the most intimidating thing in the world. The speakers only speak this quickly. You will have as much time as you can and how much time you want if you're using good time management. And also by this point, hopefully your students should be becoming autonomous learners. As I say, you may have thought that you've completed the book, you've done everything. But are there sections of the course book that you didn't cover initially? Are there sections of the Complete Advanced workbook that you didn't get round to? Well, another idea here is to photocopy these and leave them in piles at the front of the class, and your students choose what they want to practice and encourage them to practice things that they aren't entirely confident in doing. So if you've got a reading part 7 that you haven't yet done in class, in either the workbook or the course book or the teacher's handbook, encourage them to choose that and encourage them to set their own timer and follow their own time. And by this point, they should be aware of their strengths and weaknesses. So if they take on something that they're less confident in doing, well, the classroom is the place to practice that and to improve in that, as well as homework. If they can do that in the classroom and do that for homework, they are building their own exam technique and their skills. Set their own timings, take control of their own learning. And hopefully they're going to go into that exam feeling absolutely 100% prepared. And if not, that's okay, but they're going to do a good job.
Let's recap.
So that is the end of our third and final podcast in this series. We've looked at the C1 Advanced Handbook and how that can be really useful for you in class just before the run-up to the exam. We've looked at a few productive tasks that are effective at this time of the course, and we've thought about how to help them refine their exam technique in advance of the big day. Thank you very much for listening. Hope it all goes well.
That's it for today. Discover more episodes from this series on our website, cambridge.org/completeconfidence. We have podcast episodes for every level of the Cambridge exams. Come back and join us again soon. And don't worry, you've got this.
You've been listening to the Complete Confidence with Cambridge podcast, brought to you by Cambridge University Press and Assessment.